The ocean has always carried within it a kind of mystery that human beings can never truly conquer. For centuries, sailors spoke of towering walls of water rising out of nowhere, engulfing ships, and vanishing just as quickly. They called them freak waves, rogue waves, killers of the sea. But for most of the scientific world, these stories were dismissed as exaggerations, drunken sailor tales, or the last desperate words of men who never returned. The idea that waves could rise as tall as 10-story buildings in the middle of the open ocean, without storms, without earthquakes, without warning, was considered impossible. The physics, they argued, simply didn't allow it. Waves were predictable, measurable, limited by wind speed, water depth, and energy transfer. Anything beyond that was myth. And yet, shipwrecks kept happening. Cargo ships split in two under mysterious circumstances. Oil platforms reported impacts from waves far larger than meteorological records could explain. Entire crews disappeared without a trace, leaving only fragments of wood, steel, and unanswered questions drifting on the sea. For decades, the official stance remained the same. Giant rogue waves did not exist. But reality has a way of defying belief, and in time, the ocean would reveal its secret. It began not with an eyewitness account, but with mathematics. In the 1960s and 70s, a handful of physicists began modeling the nonlinear dynamics of wave motion. What they found suggested something strange. Under certain conditions, waves could borrow energy from neighboring waves, growing disproportionately large. These calculations showed that the ocean was not always the calm, average system textbooks described. Instead, it was a chaotic environment where rare, extreme events far larger than the average, were not only possible, but inevitable. The problem was, there was no hard proof. Numbers and theories weren't enough. Without direct observation, the scientific establishment dismissed the models as curiosities, not realities. Meanwhile, in the real world, sailors kept reporting encounters. An officer on a German cargo ship swore he had seen a vertical wall of water rise 25 meters high, blacking out the horizon. Survivors of wrecks described a sudden mountain moving toward them, dwarfing their vessel before smashing it apart. Insurance records showed an unusual number of ships lost under unknown circumstances. But scientists, sitting safely behind desks, insisted it was all misunderstanding, exaggeration, or human error. In 1978, the MS München, a massive German container ship considered unsinkable, disappeared in the North Atlantic. Built with reinforced steel and state-of-the-art engineering, she was designed to withstand anything the ocean could throw at her. And yet, within days of leaving port, she sent a single distress call, SOS from München. 49 degrees north, 27 west. Ship heavily listing to starboard. Ship sinking. Then silence. Rescue teams found only fragments of wreckage and a few lifeboats. Some of those lifeboats had been torn from the ship more than 20 meters above the waterline. Whatever struck the München had been far greater than any storm wave ever recorded. For the families of the crew, the answer was obvious. Something colossal had risen out of the Atlantic that night. For scientists, however, the explanation was the same as always: severe weather, structural failure, an unfortunate accident. They could not admit that a rogue wave might have been responsible, because to do so meant rewriting decades of oceanographic understanding. But by the 1990s, too many anomalies had piled up to ignore. Oil rigs in the North Sea began reporting impacts that could not be explained. These rigs, designed to withstand 20-meter waves, recorded sudden strikes at heights far beyond what theory said possible. The Draupner oil platform, in particular, became a silent witness. On New Year's Day, 1995, in the middle of a relatively moderate sea, its sensors captured something extraordinary: a wave 25.6 meters high, twice the height of surrounding waves, slamming into the structure with unimaginable force. For the first time in history, there was undeniable, instrumental proof of a rogue wave. The Draupner wave, as it came to be called, changed everything. Suddenly, what had been dismissed as sailor folklore was now an accepted reality. Rogue waves existed. They could form in calm seas. and they could destroy even the strongest human creations. But here's the unsettling truth. Scientists hadn't simply overlooked rogue waves. They had refused to believe in them. The stories didn't fit their models. And so, they ignored the evidence until it became impossible to deny. This is the story of those giant waves, the myths, the shipwrecks, the ignored warnings, and the shocking discoveries that forced the world to finally admit what sailors had always known. The ocean holds monsters, and they are very real. Act 1 begins not in the lab, but on the decks of wooden ships centuries ago, when men first set out into the unknown. Sailors in the age of exploration, venturing into the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and around the Cape of Good Hope, wrote of seas that seemed to rise like walls of glass. They spoke of white walls that appeared out of nowhere, smashing down on ships with no storm to precede them. These accounts were recorded in logs, passed into maritime folklore, and often dismissed as embellishments. After all, men living for months at sea, drinking stale water and rum, were not considered reliable witnesses by the scholars of their time. And yet, generation after generation, the same stories reappeared. Portuguese sailors described monstrous waves in the South Atlantic. Dutch explorers wrote of sudden seas taller than their masts. Whaling ships in the Pacific told of waves so high they could look down upon a vessel as though from a cliff. These were not isolated tales, they were a pattern. By the 19th century, when shipping lanes became crowded and transoceanic trade boomed, reports of sudden massive waves increased. Ship captains were trained to recognize storm swells, to calculate wind-driven seas, and to measure their risks. But what they saw in these cases defied training. Rogue waves were not part of meteorological charts. They didn't correspond with cyclones or hurricanes. They came out of clear skies as often as in storms. Few in academia dared suggest otherwise, because to believe the sailors was to challenge the entire framework of oceanography. And science, like the sea, has its own currents of resistance. But the ocean does not care for human theories. And as ships grew larger, their encounters with rogue waves became harder to dismiss. In the 20th century, luxury liners and massive tankers began encountering them. The Queen Mary, one of the most famous transatlantic liners in history, reported being nearly capsized in 1942 by a wave over 28 meters tall. In World War II, Allied vessels described freak seas that could engulf destroyers and toss battleships like toys. Yet still, the naval reports were classified or ignored, chalked up to the chaos of war. To admit rogue waves existed would be to admit that even the mightiest navies were at the mercy of something beyond their understanding. What makes this denial so fascinating is not just the science, but the psychology. Human beings want to believe the ocean is predictable. We want to think we can chart it, model it, and engineer our way through it. The idea that at any moment, without warning, a wave the size of a skyscraper can rise out of nothing and obliterate us, well, that's terrifying. And so, for decades, denial was easier. Scientists preferred to look the other way, to write the sailors off as drunk, mistaken, or delusional. But all the while, the rogue waves were out there, rising and falling, unseen except by the unlucky. In the years leading to the Draupner wave, evidence began stacking higher. Satellite data, initially collected for military and climate purposes, started showing anomalies. Scattered across the world's oceans were rare but unmistakable signals of massive waves, far larger than predicted by models. European researchers studying radar images of the South Atlantic found hundreds of wave events towering over 25 meters. Oil companies, too, quietly collected data on impacts far beyond engineering limits, but these findings were locked away in corporate vaults. Acknowledging rogue waves meant acknowledging liability, risk, and the need for costly redesigns. It was easier, financially and scientifically, to keep quiet. But the ocean was patient, and on that New Year's Day in 1995, it finally provided the irrefutable proof. The Draupner wave wasn't just an anomaly. It was a message. Rogue waves were real, and they were not as rare as anyone had believed. What terrified scientists most was the realization that these waves did not need storms, tectonic shifts, or tsunamis. They could form spontaneously from the interaction of ordinary waves, amplified by nonlinear dynamics into something monstrous. It was chaos theory, written in saltwater. And once the Draupner data went public, the world of oceanography had no choice but to admit the truth. But the truth raised even darker questions. If rogue waves were real, how many ships had they already claimed? How many disappearances long thought to be due to storms or human error were in fact the work of these hidden giants? And, most disturbingly, how many more would strike in the future? After the Draupner wave in 1995, silence was no longer possible. The data was there, recorded not by a sailor's eyes or a survivor's memory, but by an array of sensors fixed to a steel platform. Numbers don't exaggerate. Instruments don't imagine. And so, with one strike of water, centuries of denial collapsed. Rogue waves were real. But this was only the beginning, because once researchers accepted their existence, they began to ask questions. How common are these waves? Where do they strike? And, most troubling of all, can we predict them? The answers would prove even more unsettling than the myth. Oceanographers turned to satellites, a tool that until then had mostly been used for weather, military, and climate research. With radar altimeters scanning the surface of the oceans, scientists could measure wave heights across vast regions. At first, they expected rogue waves to be vanishingly rare, once in a century, perhaps once in a millennium. What they found instead was shocking. In a 3-week survey of the world's oceans, satellites detected more than 10 rogue waves towering above 25 meters. Not 10 per century. 10 in just 3 weeks. The implication was clear. Rogue waves were not freak events at all. They were a consistent part of ocean life, striking far more frequently than anyone dared to admit. Ships that vanished mysteriously, platforms that collapsed without warning, men lost at sea. The explanations were suddenly, painfully obvious. The ocean wasn't broken. Science had been blind. The mathematics of these waves defied intuition. In linear wave theory, the model scientists relied on for decades, wave heights followed a Gaussian distribution, a neat bell curve. Most waves were average, a few were larger, and extremes were vanishingly rare. But rogue waves broke that curve. They belong to what mathematicians call fat tails, extreme outliers that appear far more often than the model allows. This wasn't an accident. The ocean, like financial markets and weather systems, was governed by nonlinear dynamics. Under certain conditions, waves didn't just add together. They fed on one another, transferring energy until one became disproportionately large. It was called modulation instability, a process akin to resonance, where small inputs magnify into enormous outputs. This meant the ocean was inherently unstable. It could, at any time, give birth to a monster wave without warning, a perfect storm not of wind and rain, but of mathematics. But theory alone wasn't enough. What the world needed was proof, and proof came in the form of wreckage. Ships continued to fall victim to inexplicable disasters. In 2001, the Bremen, a German cruise liner carrying over 100 passengers, was struck by a rogue wave in the South Atlantic. The wave shattered windows on the bridge, disabling navigation systems and plunging the vessel into darkness. Miraculously, the ship survived, but the message was clear. Even modern engineering was vulnerable. Later that same year, the Caledonian Star, another cruise liner, was hit by a rogue wave near the Falkland Islands. Windows 15 meters above the waterline were smashed. Water surged into the vessel. Crew and passengers were thrown against walls, injured, terrified, convinced they were moments from death. These ships survived only because of luck, angle, and timing. Many others were not so fortunate. Maritime insurers began taking notice. For decades, unexplained losses had been quietly written off. But as more evidence emerged, the financial stakes became undeniable. Rogue waves were costing billions, and the risks could no longer be hidden. Oil companies, too, realized the truth. Their platforms, designed with maximum wave heights in mind, were not built to withstand the giants the ocean could conjure. In 1984, the Ocean Ranger, one of the largest semi-submersible rigs in the world, sank off the coast of Newfoundland during a storm. Official explanations cited design flaws and human error, but survivors of nearby vessels swore they saw waves like walls, rising higher than the rig's deck. Years later, in light of the Draupner data, the Ocean Ranger's fate looked less like an accident and more like a casualty of denial. As the evidence mounted, scientists scrambled to understand the mechanics. They began running simulations, wave tank experiments, and chaotic models. They discovered that rogue waves could form in multiple ways. One was constructive interference, ordinary waves overlapping at just the right moment to create a giant. Another was current focusing, where strong ocean currents forced waves together, amplifying their heights. The Agulhas Current off South Africa, for instance, became notorious for rogue waves, where massive swells traveling from the Southern Ocean collided with powerful opposing currents. Countless ships were lost there, often with no survivors, and only now did the science catch up to explain why. The third, and perhaps most frightening, was modulation instability, waves stealing energy from their neighbors, feeding themselves into a single monstrous crest. This wasn't just chaos, it was nature's version of a predator, a wave that grew by consuming others until it towered alone. And yet, even as the models improved, prediction remained elusive. Rogue waves were by definition spontaneous, arising in seconds, invisible until too late. Unlike hurricanes or tsunamis, they offered no warning, no chance for preparation. A ship might sail under clear skies, only to be struck by a skyscraper of water that existed for less than a minute. Survivors described them not as waves, but as walls, vertical, terrifying, impossible to climb. Some said they could feel the ship rise, hang, and then crash with bone-shattering force. Others never had the chance to describe anything at all. The wider world began to take notice. Documentaries, news reports, and scientific conferences shifted their tone. No longer did experts laugh off the tales of sailors. Instead, they admitted the unthinkable. For centuries, ordinary men had been right, and the scientists had been wrong. The ocean was not predictable, not safe, not chartable in the neat lines of textbooks. It was a world of chaos, where monsters roamed unseen. Rogue waves became a symbol of the limits of human knowledge, a reminder that nature still held secrets beyond our grasp. But the story doesn't end with acknowledgement. Acceptance brought with it a darker realization. If rogue waves were real and frequent, then humanity's entire relationship with the sea was under threat. In naval archives, researchers began to re-examine shipwrecks. The sudden disappearance of vessels like the München no longer looked mysterious. The inexplicable splitting of supertankers, the vanishing of fishing fleets, the ghostly wreckage of yachts, it all fit the rogue wave profile. In one case, the MV Derbyshire, a massive bulk carrier, sank in 1980 with all 44 crew lost. For years, the sinking was attributed to storms. But when investigators found her wreck decades later, 4,000 meters below the sea, the evidence pointed to catastrophic structural failure caused by a single overwhelming wave. She had not sunk in a storm. She had been crushed by something larger, something sudden, something her builders never designed her to survive. By the early 2000s, the science had shifted from denial to obsession. Research projects launched across the globe, using satellites, buoys, and radar to hunt for rogue waves. And they found them everywhere: the North Atlantic, the South Pacific, the Indian Ocean. The very water sailors had always warned about, off the coast of South Africa, near Cape Horn, across the North Sea, were confirmed hotbeds. But even calm seas were not safe. Rogue waves could rise in the middle of nowhere, without storms, without warning. The terrifying truth was that they did not need an excuse to exist. They were simply part of the ocean's nature, waiting for the right moment to show themselves. For centuries, The voices of sailors had been drowned out by the arrogance of science. Now, their words were vindicated, but at a terrible cost. The acknowledgement of rogue waves meant acknowledging the fragility of human mastery. All our ships, all our platforms, all our confidence in the predictability of the seas, it was all built on an illusion. The ocean had always been bigger, stronger, more unpredictable than we dared admit. And in the shadows of this revelation, another question began to surface. If we had denied rogue waves for so long, what else was the ocean hiding? What other monsters waited, unseen, in the restless dark? The 21st century began with the truth finally out in the open. Rogue waves were real. But knowing they existed was not the same as understanding them, and understanding them was not the same as surviving them. For scientists, the challenge became prediction. For engineers, it became survival. For sailors, it remained what it had always been, fear. Because when a rogue wave rises on the horizon, there is no time for science, no time for theory. There is only impact. The most haunting fact to emerge from modern research is just how frequent these monsters are. Satellite surveys, radar measurements, and buoy data revealed that rogue waves occur not once in a blue moon, but regularly, all across the oceans of the world. They may not be an everyday event, but they are common enough to pose a constant threat to global shipping. At any given time, thousands of cargo vessels, tankers, and passenger ships crisscross the oceans, carrying the lifeblood of modern trade. The world's economy depends on their safe passage. Yet every one of those vessels sails under the shadow of waves they may never see coming. For shipping companies, the statistics are chilling. Each year, dozens of ships vanish at sea, often without explanation. Many are small, but some are massive vessels, built of steel, designed to withstand the harshest conditions. Yet they vanish as though swallowed whole. Insurance reports call them lost with all hands. Official records list storms, structural failure, or unknown causes. But when you compare the locations, the conditions, and the eyewitness accounts, a darker picture emerges. Rogue waves are not rare killers. They are silent predators, responsible for a significant portion of maritime disappearances. Every time a ship disappears without distress signals, every time debris washes ashore without survivors, every time investigators shake their heads and say unknown cause, the possibility of a rogue wave lurks just behind the uncertainty. Modern engineers face a cruel paradox. To design ships that can withstand rogue waves would mean making them vastly larger, heavier, and more expensive. It would mean redesigning entire fleets at unimaginable cost. Instead, most vessels are built for statistical averages. They can handle storms, yes. They can withstand harsh seas, yes. But the giants? No ship can be built invincible. And so the industry quietly accepts the risk. Ships will be lost. Crews will vanish. The ocean will take its toll. It is the price of doing business on a planet covered in water. For scientists, prediction remains a tantalizing but distant dream. Rogue waves appear suddenly, without warning, and collapse just as fast. Their lifespan can be minutes, sometimes only seconds. Unlike hurricanes, they cannot be tracked across oceans. Unlike tsunamis, they are not tied to seismic events. They are born of chaos itself, where wind, current, and non-linear mathematics converge in an instant to create something vast. Some research has suggested that localized radar systems, capable of scanning kilometers of sea in real time, might provide a few minutes of warning. A few minutes might mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. But deploying such systems on every ship in the world is expensive, impractical, and far from reality. And even then, what can a ship do in 3 minutes to prepare for a 30-meter wall of water? In truth, prediction remains a fragile hope, more theory than practice. The most advanced research comes not from academics alone, but from industries with the most to lose. Oil companies have poured millions into understanding rogue waves, because their platforms are sitting ducks in the open sea. Unlike ships, they cannot maneuver. They cannot turn to meet a wave bow first. They must stand and absorb the blow. For them, prediction and mitigation are a matter of survival. But even with all their resources, the conclusion remains grim. Rogue waves cannot be prevented. They cannot be diverted. They can only be endured or not. Perhaps the most unsettling realization came not from the rigs or the cargo ships, but from passenger liners. Cruise ships, carrying thousands of tourists, now venture across oceans every year. These floating cities are taller, wider, and more luxurious than any vessels in history. But they are not invulnerable. In 2010, the Louis Majesty, a cruise liner sailing in the Mediterranean, was struck by a rogue wave. Windows 15 meters above the waterline shattered, killing 2 passengers and injuring many more. The sea had given a brutal reminder: it does not care how rich or powerful you are. To the ocean, all ships are the same, fragile objects riding the surface of something unimaginably vast. For coastal nations, the threat goes beyond shipping. Rogue waves can strike shorelines, harbors, and even surfers. While most dissipate before reaching shallow water, those that survive can devastate beaches without warning. In South Africa, where the Agulhas Current creates one of the world's worst breeding grounds for rogue waves, entire coastal communities live with the knowledge that monsters lurk offshore. Fishermen leave port knowing they may never return, not because of storms, but because of something they cannot predict, cannot fight, and cannot see until it is too late. And yet, there is a strange beauty in this danger. Rogue waves are reminders of what the ocean truly is: not a highway, not a playground, not a commodity, but a force of nature beyond control. For all our satellites, sensors, and simulations, we remain small against the sea. The arrogance that led scientists to deny these waves for centuries has been replaced by a new humility, a recognition that there are limits to human knowledge. The ocean is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be respected. Some researchers now speak of rogue waves as a kind of warning, a message from a natural world. In an era where we chart, measure, and monetize every aspect of the Earth, rogue waves remind us that not everything can be tamed. They are chaos incarnate, proof that even in the 21st century, the world still holds secrets we cannot master. They are not myths, not sailors' tales, but truths written in salt and water, rising out of nothing to humble us. So the next time you look out over the ocean and see its calm surface stretching to the horizon, remember this: somewhere out there, right now, a wall of water is rising. A rogue wave, unseen, perhaps unnoticed, will form, strike, and vanish. No one may witness it. No one may record it. But it will exist. Because that is the nature of the ocean. It gives, it takes, it creates, it destroys. And in its heart, hidden from view, it harbors monsters that science once refused to believe in. The giant waves are real. They always have been. The only question that remains is how many more ships, how many more lives, will be claimed before we learn not to dismiss what sailors have always known. The ocean does not lie. The men who vanished did not lie. It was we who refused to listen. The story of rogue waves is not just about water, or physics, or ships. It is about human arrogance, our desperate need to believe we can master nature, and the sobering truth that some forces will forever remain beyond control. For centuries, we denied their existence. Now, we must live with their reality. And in that reality, the ocean stands undefeated, a reminder that on this planet, there are still giants we cannot tame.